Okay, we are back for the third video in the Factorial ANOVA. You can see that I have left the summary of the sums up there on the upper left-hand side of the board, and I've also written in the answers for the basic ratios that we just calculated. So what we're going to do now is calculate our sums of squares. All right, so our first sum of squares is the sum of squares for A, and I'm going to put a little star next to that because the formula for that is the same as it's been in all of our ANOVAs. It's the basic ratio for A minus the basic ratio for T. So in this problem, we've got 204 minus 192, which equals 12. Our next sum of squares is our sum of squares for B. And I'm hoping that some of you can guess what the formula for this might be. If the sum of squares for A is A minus T, the sum of squares for B is going to be B minus T. All right, so our B is over here is 192, and our T is also 192. So we've got 192 minus 192, which is a 0. All right, so that's a little unusual. We haven't had a sum of squares work out to be a 0 yet. There is a reason for it, and you'll see why that sum of squares is 0 as we move a little deeper into the problem. All right, our next sum of squares is our sum of squares A times B. And if you remember from the repeated measures ANOVA, we had a sum of squares A times S, and that was one of our more complicated sums of squares. This is our most complicated sum of squares in this problem. So the sum of squares A times B, the formula for this is AB minus A minus B plus T. All right, so it's AB minus A minus B plus T. Don't forget, you're adding in that T, you are not subtracting it. All right, so our AB is 216, subtract our A, which is 204, subtract our B, which is 192, and then add T, which is 192. All right, so when you do the math on that, that works out to be 12. Our next sum of squares is our sum of squares S over AB. All right, so the formula for that is Y minus AB. So our Y is 222, our AB is 216, so this equals 6. And then our last sum of squares is our sum of squares T, and I'm going to put a little star next to that because this is the same formula it's been all along. It's Y minus T. So 222 minus 192 is equal to 30. All right, so I'll explain in a second what all these sums of squares refer to. But first, let's do our check. So just like in all the other ANOVAs, the smaller sums of squares should add up to the total. So 12 plus 0 plus 12 plus 6 does in fact equal 30. All right, so hopefully before you guys started watching these videos to work through the problem, you looked at the lecture. And in the lecture, I talked about the different effects that you can find in the Factorial ANOVA. And when you look at the little labels on these sums of squares, they're informational in terms of what effect we're looking at. So the sum of squares for A, this is going to be looking eventually, once we get to the mean squares and the F ratio, this is going to be looking at the effect of A, which in this case, in this problem, is alcohol. B is going to be looking at the effect, the main effect of B, which in this problem, our independent variable B is gender. A times B is going to be looking at the interaction, which again, if you read the lecture, the interaction is really about how the two variables, the two independent variables, in this case alcohol and gender, how they interact. So for example, is the effect of alcohol the same in males and females? S over AB, this is going to turn into our error. And then T, as always, is our total. All right, so I was hoping I was going to fit my degrees of freedom on here, but this board is super tiny, so I'm going to stop the video now. The next video will have the degrees of freedom.